Corey Feldman and Lauryn Hill were the couple everyone looked up to. They were the embodiment of stability and success in their neighborhood. Corey was the kind of man who took pride in the simple things he loved. He loved his work as a carpenter. He found solace in the feel of wood beneath his hands. He was happy creating something tangible and lasting. His business was modest but successful enough to provide them with a comfortable life. He was the steady rock in their marriage. He was a man of few words but deep emotions. He was intent on the life they had built together. Every evening, he would return home from his workshop covered in sawdust and his clothes marked with the day's labor. He'd come home from work, marked with the day's labor, and go in quietly. He was always happy to see Lauryn and share dinner with her after a long day. Lauryn, on the other hand, was the social butterfly, the life and soul of every party. She loved attention and was often the loudest laugher in the room. Lauryn was a real people person. She had a way of charming everyone she met and making friends wherever she went. She was great at managing their home, keeping everything in order while also pursuing her hobbies. She was an excellent gardener, and her flower beds were a sight to behold. With her life and her paintings just a hobby, Lauryn was getting compliments from visitors. She was the perfect hostess, always ready to throw a dinner party or a neighborhood barbecue where she would play the role of the gracious, loving wife. But behind the scenes of this seemingly perfect life, Lauryn was growing increasingly restless. The routine that Corey found comforting had begun to feel like a prison to her. The predictability of their days, the same faces, the same conversations, all of it started to weigh on her. Corey's contentment with their life only deepened her frustration. At first, Lauryn tried to suppress her feelings. She told herself it was just a phase that every marriage goes through, but the discontent kept growing until she couldn't ignore it anymore. She started seeking excitement in small, harmless ways, like flirting with strangers at the grocery store or lingering a little too long. She had long conversations with the handsome barista at the local coffee shop, and these small thrills gave her a taste of the excitement she craved. However, it wasn't enough. One evening, while browsing online out of sheer boredom, she stumbled upon a chat room. It was a place where people went to flirt and escape their mundane lives. Lauryn was drawn to it like a moth to a flame. She started chatting with different men and enjoyed the attention. It was here that she met Timothy. He was everything Corey was not. He was younger with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. He made her feel alive. The attraction between them was immediate, and their conversations quickly escalated from innocent flirting to something much more intense. Lauryn found herself sneaking out of the house to meet Timothy, and their clandestine encounters became the highlight of her life. Her affair became all-consuming, filling the void in her life that her relationship with Corey no longer provided. She stayed out late, returning home with excuses that Corey never questioned. She was too trusting and too wrapped up in her own world to notice what was happening right under his nose as Lauryn fell deep into her affair with Timothy. As a result, she began to distance herself from Corey. She was distancing herself from Corey, both emotionally and physically. She no longer sought his company and no longer cared if he noticed the changes in her. The life they had built together, which had once been a source of pride and joy, now felt like a burden. She was eager to escape from Corey, but he noticed the changes in Lauryn. However, he kept his suspicions to himself. He kept hoping it was just a phase. He'd always been the type to avoid confrontation, preferring to push his feelings aside in favor of maintaining peace. But the late nights, the secret phone calls, and the coldness in Lauryn's demeanor were impossible to ignore. He wasn't a fool, he knew. Something was clearly wrong. The woman who used to greet him with warmth now seemed distant. Her eyes never lingered on him for long, as if he were just another piece of furniture in the house. One night, as Lauryn was out again, Corey found himself sitting alone in their dimly lit living room. The only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the mantelpiece, each tick amplifying the emptiness of the room. The old clock on the mantelpiece was ticking away, emphasizing the emptiness of the room. He was sitting in his favorite armchair, the leather worn and familiar under his touch, but the comfort it once provided was gone. His thoughts were racing back to the early days of their marriage, when they were inseparable. They had been so Corey remembered how in love he was with Lauryn, and how full of dreams and plans for the future he felt. He remembered how she used to light up at the sight of him, and how she would wrap her arms around him and pull him close as if she couldn't bear to be apart. But those days felt like a lifetime ago now. She barely looked at him, and when she did, her gaze seemed she looked at him as if he were invisible. He thought about confronting her, demanding the truth, but the fear of what he might hear kept him silent. Instead, he decided to wait and gather more evidence before making any move. He wouldn't act on suspicion alone. The idea of spying on his own wife made him feel it was starting to affect his health, but the thought of being made a fool of or living a lie was even worse. Lauren was becoming bolder by the day, fueled by the thrill of her affair. One evening she returned home after another rendezvous with Timothy. Her cheeks were flushed with excitement, and her eyes were shining with a mixture of guilt. Corey was in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner. He was moving slowly and deliberately, as if he were trying to keep himself grounded in the mundane task. Lauren watched him for a moment, her mind racing. She could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his hands gripped the knife just a little tighter. She had an idea. It was a twisted, thrilling idea that made her heart race with anticipation. She walked over to him, her steps light, her voice sweet yet tinged with something darker. "Corey, there's something I need to tell you." The words tasted bitter on her tongue, even as she savored the anticipation. The power they gave her, he looked up, his eyes searching hers for any hint of what was coming. The kitchen seemed to close around him, the air thick with unspoken words. "What is it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady though his heart was pounding in his chest. Lauren took a deep breath, steadying herself for the bomb she was about to drop. "I've been seeing someone." Her words sliced through the air like a knife. "His name is Timothy and he's over tonight." Corey froze, the knife in his hand hovering above the cutting board for a moment. He thought he hadn't heard her correctly. Maybe it was some kind of sick joke. "What are you talking about?" he managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. He was clinging to the reality he could still see as a possibility. Lauren smiled, but it was a cold, cruel smile that sent chills down his spine. "He'll be here soon. When he arrives, you're going to leave us alone." She carried on in a matter-of-fact tone as if she were discussing dinner plans. "He wants you out of the house while we finish. You can't refuse. Get out now." Corey felt sick to his stomach. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The woman he loved, the woman he had shared a life with, was standing in front of him, telling him to leave his own home so she could be with another man. She was standing in front of him, telling him to leave his own home so she could be with another man. He searched her face, desperate to find some sign of the woman he had married, but all he saw was a stranger. He didn't even recognize her. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mix of anger, disbelief, and sadness. Lauren's expression hardened, and her eyes narrowed. "I'm done with this marriage, Corey. You've become a real pain, and I'm tired of pretending. Give me what you can't, and leave us alone." Corey stared at her, his mind reeling. He wanted to scream, to shout, to demand she explained herself, but he knew it was pointless. The woman standing before him was gone. Without another word, he set down the knife and walked out of the kitchen, his heart heavy with despair. He could feel Lauren's eyes on him, but he didn't look back. He couldn't bear to see the satisfaction in her gaze, the final nail in the coffin of their broken marriage. Lauren watched as Corey quietly left the house. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the empty hallway. She had never felt so in control, so alive. Pouring herself a glass of she poured herself a glass of wine and leaned against the kitchen counter, her heart pounding with anticipation for Timothy's arrival. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more thrilling than the last. She had crossed a line she could never uncross, and instead of feeling guilty, she felt a strange sense of liberation outside. Corey stood on the porch, his hands trembling uncontrollably. The cool night air brushed against his skin, but he barely noticed. He felt like he couldn't breathe or think. The weight of Lauren's words pressed down on him, suffocating him with their cruelty. He glanced back at the house, the warm lights inside mocking him. In stark contrast to the cold emptiness he felt unable to face, he turned away and began walking slowly towards the backyard. His footsteps were heavy, as if he were trudging through thick mud, with each step more laborious than the last. The shed stood at the far end of the yard, a small, weathered structure. The shed was always his sanctuary, a place to escape the world and clear his mind. It was where he went to find solace in the simple act of working with his hands. But tonight, the familiar sight filled him with dread. As he approached the door, he felt a sense of dread. It creaked open, and he heard a sound that had always been comforting but now seemed ominous, like a whisper from the past. He stepped inside and looked around. The scent of wood and sawdust, usually so calming, now felt suffocating. He looked around the small, cluttered space. His eyes scanning the quarry looked around the workbench, where tools were scattered. His gaze then settled on a wooden box tucked away in the corner. It was old, covered in a thick layer of dust. It was a relic from a time when things were simpler, when life was filled with hope, not despair. He hadn't opened it in years. Since his father passed it down to him along with the shed itself, Corey hesitated. His heart was pounding in his chest. The box held memories and pieces of his past that he had long buried, but something drew him to it now. He had an inexplicable urge that he couldn't resist. He slowly walked over to it, his hands shaking as he lifted the lid. The tools were all neatly arranged inside the box, with each one carefully polished and sharpened. There were hammers, chisels, saws, and other familiar items that had once brought him comfort. But there was one item that caught his eye, a hunting knife. Its blade in the gloom of the shed, the knife shone. It was old, the handle worn smooth from years of use. His father had given it to him when he was a young boy, a rite of passage that had meant so much at the time. Now, as he held it in his hand, the cold steel pressing against his palm, the knife took on a new meaning. Corey grabbed the knife. He felt a dark primal urge rising within him, something he'd never felt before. His mind was a chaotic storm of emotions, rage, betrayal, despair. But all of them coalesced into one single thought, revenge. The world around him seemed to fade away. The sounds of the night, muffled by the roar of blood, was pounding in his ears. He'd been pushed to the limit, and now, standing in the shed that had once been his refuge, he knew there was no turning back. He looked down at the knife. Its blade was sharp and unforgiving. It was a tool, but in this moment, it felt like a weapon, a means to an end. The calm, rational part of his mind tried to reason with him, to fight back, tried to remind him of who he was and of the man he had always striven to be. But that voice was drowned out by the overwhelming tide of anger and pain. Corey knew what he had to do. The line between right and wrong blurred, and all that remained was the cold, hard reality of the situation with the knife. Corey turned and walked out of the shed, the door closing behind him. The night was silent, the stars hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, as he made his way back to the house. His footsteps no longer felt heavy. There was a sense of purpose in his stride. Corey was no longer the man he had been just hours ago. The man he'd been before had been broken and discarded by the woman he loved. The man walking back towards the house, however, was different. He was a man with nothing left to lose, and that made him more dangerous than he'd ever been. Before Lauren was sprawled comfortably on the living room sofa, her legs draped over the armrest, having a glass of wine. A smug satisfaction playing across her lips. The evening had gone exactly to plan, and the thrill of power surged through her, making her feel more alive than she had in years. Then the doorbell rang. The doorbell finally rang, and she didn't even flinch. She sat down, her glass of wine in hand, feeling a rush of anticipation. She got up to greet Timothy, who entered the house with an air of confidence, his stride confident, as though he had already claimed ownership of everything within its walls. She greeted him with a sultry smile. Her heart was racing, not from love or affection, but from the sheer audacity of what they were about to do. She took his hand and led him through the hallway, her mind focused on the night of passion she expected to unfold. They were barely inside the bedroom when they heard the front door creak open. Timothy paused. His hands were still on Lauren's waist, and he was smiling. "I'm back already," he said. His tone was teasing, and it excited and irritated Lauren. She laughed lightly, trying to brush off the sudden unease that prickled at the back of her mind. "Don't worry about him," she replied, though her voice held an edge. She hadn't meant to sound like that. The more relaxed she was, the better. But as Corey's footsteps echoed through the house, closer and closer, Lauren's confidence began to falter. There was something off about the way he had left earlier. So quietly, so resigned. It had seemed too easy. Too unlike him. She pushed the thought away and turned her attention back to Timothy, but the unease lingered, gnawing at her composure. Then Corey appeared in the doorway, and Lauren's world stopped. He stood there, his face a blank canvas devoid of any emotion. Yet there was something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. Corey was holding a hunting knife, the blade gleaming ominously in the dim bedroom light. "What are you doing?" Lauren's voice came out shaky, betraying the fear that was quickly overtaking her bravado. Timothy sensed the tension but misread its depth, stepping forward to try to assert his dominance in the situation. "Hey man, you need to calm down," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Just leave us alone, like she said." But Corey didn't move. He just stood there, staring at them with eyes that seemed to have been drained of all humanity. It was as if he was looking through them into some abyss only he could see. Lauren's fear intensified. This wasn't the Corey she knew. The quiet, submissive husband who had always been so easy to manipulate was gone. In his place was a man she no longer recognized. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This was a side of Corey she had never imagined existed, and it terrified her. "Corey, please put the knife down," she pleaded, her voice trembling as her heart pounded in her chest. But Corey didn't listen. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step forward, the blade in his hand catching the light in a way that made Lauren's stomach churn. Timothy still underestimated the seriousness of the situation and tried to push past Corey, but Corey was on him in a flash. The knife sliced through the air with terrifying precision, and Timothy's smirk vanished as he was replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated fear. His scream pierced the air, a guttural, primal sound that reverberated through the house and sent chills down Lauren's spine. She watched in frozen horror as Corey attacked with a ferocity she'd never thought possible, with blood splattered across the walls and the floor. Lauren's body betrayed her as she wanted to move, to run, to do anything. But she felt frozen in place. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, refusing to obey her. In a desperate attempt to escape, she found herself paralyzed and trapped in the nightmare she had unwittingly created. All she could do was watch as Corey exacted his brutal revenge, each of his movements methodical and merciless, like a man possessed. When it was over, Timothy lay on the floor, barely conscious, his body a bloody, broken mess. The room was eerily silent, except for the ragged breaths of the man who had just been reduced to a shadow of his former self. Corey turned to Lauren, his eyes cold and devoid of any warmth or recognition. He was no longer the man she had married. He was something else entirely, something terrifying. "It's your turn," Corey said. His voice was eerily calm, each word dripping with a deadly finality. Lauren stumbled back, her heart racing. His terror gripped her like a vice. "Corey, please don't do this. I love you so much," she begged, tears streaming down her face. But there was no mercy in his eyes, no hesitation in his steps. He advanced toward her, the knife still holding the knife. Lauren knew her life would never be the same. She had played a dangerous game, and now the price was being paid with blood. As the night unfolded, the violence became more brutal. Corey was merciless, striking her with brutal precision. They had both underestimated him, thinking he was weak and passive. But he had a darkness inside him neither of them knew existed. When it was over, they were both in a state of shock. Their bodies were covered in bruises and cuts, and their minds were. He was on the verge of shock. His chest was heaving from the exertion of what he had done. His clothes were soaked with blood, a stark reminder of the night's events. His hands were still trembling and bore the marks of his unbridled fury. His knuckles were raw from the blows he had delivered. He looked down at Lauren, who lay crumpled on the floor, and she was motionless on the floor, her once beautiful face swollen beyond recognition, streaked with a gruesome mixture of tears and blood. Timothy was lying nearby, barely clinging to consciousness, groaning in pain. Corey felt oddly detached, as though he were an observer rather than a participant in the scene. He was still a part of the scene, but the rage that had fueled his actions had drained away, leaving behind a hollow emptiness. He surveyed the room, taking in the destruction he had caused: overturned furniture, blood-spattered walls, and broken bodies of the two people who had shattered his world. For a brief moment he was overcome with doubt. Had he gone too far? Was there a line he'd crossed that he could never return from? But as quickly as the doubt came, it was swept away by the memory of Lauren's cold, cutting words. She'd looked at him with disdain, as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience or a burden she'd grown tired of carrying. She'd ordered him out of his own home to make way for her lover. The betrayal still stung like a festering wound. He refused to let it go, given how she had betrayed him. How could he have reacted any differently? Corey's eyes hardened as he pushed away any lingering doubts about what he had done. He had done it out of a sense of justice, to reclaim the power that had been stripped from him. He had loved Lauren with every fiber of his being and devoted his life to making her happy. In return, she had destroyed him, long before he had laid a hand on her. He gave her one last look, before turning his back on the scene. Corey turned and walked out of the house, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He didn't know where he was going, or what he would do next. The life he had known was over, reduced to rubble by the events of the night. The only thing he was sure of was that he couldn't stay there any longer. The air outside was crisp, the morning sun just beginning to rise above the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. He didn't look back as he walked down the driveway, his mind a blur of thoughts. He couldn't make sense of anything around him. The world felt surreal, like a dream you can't wake up from. As he reached the end of the driveway, sirens wailed in the distance, getting louder with each passing second. But Corey didn't speed up. He kept walking, putting one foot in front of the other, leaving the house, the memories, and the life that had led him to this moment behind. He was a man adrift, drifting into an uncertain future. When Lauren woke up, she was faced with a stark and unfamiliar environment. The fluorescent lights overhead made her eyes sting as she adjusted to the brightness. She was in pain, a deep throbbing ache that seemed to permeate her entire body. Her head felt heavy, her mind clouded with confusion, and the remnants of what she hoped were just nightmares. As her vision cleared, she realized she was in a hospital room. The walls were a drab, clinical white. The air was filled with the soft beeping of machines and the faint hum of voices in the hallway. She tried to move, but a sharp pain shot through her side, forcing her to stay still. It was only then that she became aware of the bandages wrapped around her arms and torso, the 4 drips snaking from her hand, and the steady rhythmic pulse of the heart monitor beside her bed. Panic set in as fragmented memories of the previous night began to coalesce into something horrifyingly real. She was cold and unrecognizable. She could still see the hunting knife glinting in his hand, as clearly as if it had happened only moments ago. She could hear Timothy's screams, a sound so primal and terrified that it made her blood run cold. The memory was too vivid to be a dream, too raw to be anything but the truth. Just then, a nurse entered the room. Her expression was a practiced mask of concern. She moved with a quiet efficiency, checking the monitors before noticing that Lauren was awake. "You're awake," the nurse said softly. The nurse was professional yet gentle. "How are you feeling, Lauren?" Lauren tried to speak, but her throat felt like sandpaper, raw and dry. The nurse noticed her struggling and quickly filled a plastic cup with water, holding it to Lauren's lips to help her take a few sips. The water was cool and soothing, but it didn't ease the terror clawing at her insides. "Where am I?" Lauren whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're at the county hospital," the nurse replied calmly. "You were brought in last. You've had a rough night with multiple injuries, but you're in a stable condition now. You're going to be okay." Lauren's eyes darted around the room, searching for something familiar to anchor her in this new reality. The room was empty, save for the medical equipment and the nurse by her side. There was no sign of Timothy. A wave of dread washed over her as she forced herself to ask the question she was most afraid of. "What about Timothy?" The nurse's face darkened. Her expression showed pity. She said he was in the ICU, and although he was stable, his injuries were severe. The doctors were doing everything they could. The words hit Lauren like a punch to the gut. Timothy, her lover, the man she had risked everything for, was fighting for his life, and she was lying here, helpless, her own body a wreck. She wanted to cry, scream, or feel something. Instead, she felt an overwhelming numbness. She should have been, she thought. She lay there in silence, the nurse's words echoing in her mind. Timothy was still alive, but for how long? What would happen if he didn't make it? Would Corey be satisfied with what he had done, or was there more to his revenge? "Is Corey here?" Lauren asked, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and hope. Despite everything, some irrational part of her clung to the idea that Corey might have come to see her. Some part of the man she had known still existed. The nurse shook her head. Her expression was neutral but firm. "Nobody's come to see you yet, but the police were here earlier. They'll need to speak with you once you're feeling better." Lauren had to face the music. She closed her eyes, overwhelmed by everything that had happened. She had brought this on herself, and there was no turning back. The nightmare was far from over, and she knew that the hardest part was still to come. The days that followed were a blur of police interviews, medical treatments, and endless hours of lying in a hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. Lauren felt trapped in a nightmare, unable to escape the weight of her actions pressing down on her. The hospital room, which had once been a place of recovery, had become her prison. Its white walls were a constant reminder of the hell she had wrought. The police came with their relentless questions, their faces a mix of curiosity and professional detachment. Their questions were probing and unforgiving, stripping away a layer of her carefully maintained composure with each interrogation. Each time she recounted the events of that fateful night, it was like reliving the horror anew. Corey's gaze was cold and emotionless, and Tim's screams were still ringing in her ears. It felt as though the walls of the room were closing in, suffocating her with the enormity of her own guilt. The police told her what had happened to Corey. He'd turned himself in shortly after leaving the house, walking into the local police station covered in blood. His demeanor was eerily calm as he confessed to everything: his assault on Timothy, his attack on Lauren, and the destruction he'd left in his wake. There was no trial, no lengthy legal battle. Corey had pleaded guilty to all charges, and his lack of remorse shocked everyone. The courtroom was devoid of dramatic showdowns or emotional outbursts. Corey's admission was simple and chilling. His blank stare reflected the cold indifference he felt towards his actions. Lauren was overwhelmed by a tumultuous mix of emotions. Anger simmered beneath her surface, directed at Corey for the brutality he had inflicted. But intertwined with that anger was a deep. She was sitting there, feeling guilty for her role in setting off the chain of events that led to the violence. She had been the catalyst, her betrayal driving Corey to the brink. The realization was unbearable. Her actions had not only destroyed her marriage, but also left deep scars on everyone involved. Timothy's condition was precarious for weeks. His injuries, though eventually stabilized, had left him in a state of profound vulnerability. Lauren went to see him in the hospital. The spark that had once been in his eyes was gone, replaced by a vacant, haunted look. The man who had once been her lover could barely look at her. Their relationship, once fueled by excitement and infidelity, was now a painful reminder of their shared transgressions. There was no solace to be found in their encounters, only a stark realization of the damage done. Lauren's own physical injuries healed. The emotional scars were deeper and more enduring than she had ever imagined. Those who had envied her perfect life now avoided her, their pitying glances and whispered judgments a constant reminder of her fall from grace. The community that had once celebrated her now saw her as a pariah, a cautionary tale of a life gone terribly wrong. The reality of her situation had finally settled in. As she lay in her hospital bed, alone and broken, her marriage was in ruins, her reputation obliterated. She had nothing left but painful memories and the relentless question of how she would rebuild her life. The path to redemption, if such a path existed, seemed impossibly distant. All that remained was a profound sense of isolation and the haunting knowledge of the lives she had irrevocably altered.